She was called the most beautiful princess in Europe. She was called a bargaining piece, promised to a foreign prince before she could read. She was Queen of France for 82 days and was addressed by that title at court for the rest of her life. She was the sister who defied a king and was allowed to keep her head, a privilege not everyone close to that same king would be granted. Mary Tudor usually appears as a minor figure in the story of her brother, Henry VIII, mentioned once or twice and then forgotten. Her own story runs from a nursery in Kent to a coronation in Paris to a quiet manor in Suffolk, and it stands on its own terms. This is a story about a woman treated for most of her life as property of the English crown, valuable enough to trade across Europe, rarely asked what she actually wanted. The Tudor dynasty her father had founded in 1485 was still new and still fragile, and every one of his children's marriages was, from the moment of their birth, a matter of state rather than personal choice. This is about the single moment Mary refused to be traded again, and what that refusal cost her. It is about beauty used as currency, marriage used as foreign policy, and a loyalty that outlasted every man who tried to direct it. Mary was born on the 18th of March, 1496, at Sheen Palace, later rebuilt as Richmond Palace. She was the fifth child of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and the youngest to survive infancy. An older sister, also named Elizabeth, had died only months before Mary was born, and two younger siblings, Edmund and Catherine, would die in infancy in the years after. Of 8 children born to the king and queen, only 3 lived to adulthood: Margaret, Henry, and Mary herself. She grew up mainly at Eltham Palace alongside her brother Arthur, her sister Margaret, and her brother Henry, given her own household by the age of 6 and tutors who taught her French, Latin, music, and dance. She learned the lute and the clavichord. Contemporaries described golden hair reaching to her waist, and the scholar Erasmus is said to have remarked that nature had never made anyone more beautiful. She was 7 when her mother died in childbirth, and 8 when her elder sister Margaret left for Scotland to marry King James IV. A marriage arranged for the same reason nearly every one of Mary's own marriages would later be arranged, to secure peace between crowns. With Arthur already dead, only Mary and Henry remained close in age and close to home, and the two grew attached in a way that held for the rest of Mary's life. Their bond would later show itself in an unusual way. When Henry's first surviving child, a daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was born in 1516, he named her Mary after his sister. In 1509, their father died and Henry became king. Mary watched his coronation procession pass beneath a window in Cheapside, one of the few times in her life she watched a great occasion rather than took part in one. Her value on the marriage market was recognized before she could walk. An offer arrived from the Duke of Milan for his son when she was 2 years old. A more serious proposal followed in 1500. At 4 years old, she was pledged to the infant son of Philip of Burgundy, a boy named Charles, himself only a few months old, who would grow up to rule as Holy Roman Emperor. The arrangement was renewed in 1507 and formalized the following December in a ceremony where 9-year-old Mary recited her marriage vows in French to a groom she had never met and would not meet for years, if ever. Gifts arrived from him periodically over the following years, including one of the largest rubies known in Europe at the time. The wedding itself was fixed for 1514, once Charles turned 14. It never took place. 6 years of exchanged gifts and formal correspondence ended within weeks, once a more useful arrangement presented itself. Mary had no say in either decision, the making of the match or its undoing. She was about to have even less say in what came next. By 1513, the alliance behind the match had changed. England's relationship with the Habsburgs cooled, and Cardinal Wolsey, by then Henry's most trusted minister, began negotiating in a different direction, toward France instead. England and France had recently been at war, with Henry personally leading a campaign onto French soil the year before. and a royal marriage was the fastest way to seal a peace neither side wanted to break again soon. In the summer of 1514, on her brother's instruction, Mary renounced the 6-year engagement to Charles. Within weeks, she was betrothed to someone else. Louis XII, King of France, 52 years old, already known to his own subjects for the tax relief and legal reforms of his reign. He had been married twice before and had no surviving son from either marriage, only 2 daughters, which meant his throne was set to pass to his son-in-law and cousin, Francis of Angoulême, unless he could still father an heir of his own. He was, on top of all this, so troubled by gout that he could barely stand. Mary was 18 and she did not want this marriage. She said so to her brother directly. By multiple contemporary accounts, she agreed only after obtaining a promise from him, that if she outlived Louis, her next husband would be chosen by no one but herself. Henry agreed. Whether he meant to honor that promise or simply said what was needed to secure her cooperation was never recorded. Mary would hold him to it regardless. The marriage was sealed by proxy at Greenwich on the 13th of August, 1514, with the Duke of Longueville standing in for the absent French king. Mary crossed to France in early October. Louis, by report, was eager to meet his young bride and called her a nymph from heaven on meeting her. The formal wedding took place at Abbeville on the 9th of October. A Venetian ambassador who watched her arrive described her riding beneath a white canopy decorated with roses and porcupines. Louis's own royal emblem, seated on a white horse and dressed in stiff gold brocade. Behind her came an ornate litter trimmed with lilies. Then several of her principal English ladies, richly dressed, followed by carriages carrying still more attendants. Among the young women who crossed with her into royal service, by most accounts, was a teenage Mary Boleyn, whose family would later become Mary's fiercest rivals at court, though no one at Abbeville that day could have foreseen it. Mary was crowned Queen of France at the Basilica of Saint-Denis on the 5th of November. For a few weeks, she held the position her brother had built for her, a young foreign queen, admired for her looks and her bearing, still learning the language and customs of a country she had never visited before that October. She did not hold the position long. Louis, determined to produce the heir his 2 previous marriages had failed to give him, saw his health decline rapidly within weeks. The rumor of the time was that the effort in the marriage bed had killed him outright. Modern historians point instead to his gout and his generally worsening health. Whichever it was, Louis XII died on the 1st of January, 1515, 82 days after the wedding. Mary, 18 and already widowed, withdrew into the customary 40 days of mourning seclusion, dressed in white, to determine whether she carried an heir to the French throne. She did not. The name attached to her during that seclusion, La Reine Blanche, the White Queen, stayed with her for years afterward. A childless dowager queen was, to the courts of Europe, simply an asset waiting to be reassigned. The new French king, Francis I, moved quickly to keep her in France, putting forward candidates for a second husband, each one chosen to serve French interests rather than English ones. Mary understood exactly what was happening to her. Henry, for his part, sent his closest friend to bring her home, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Brandon had grown up at Henry's side since boyhood, become one of the finest jousters at the English court, and had known Mary for just as long. He had been married before to a woman named Anne Brown, who had died some years earlier, leaving him with 2 young daughters. Before Brandon left England, Henry made him promise not to propose to Mary himself. That promise did not survive Paris. Mary, aware that she was about to become someone's political property a second time, pressed Brandon to marry her immediately, before either her brother or the French king could redirect her into another arrangement. Brandon hesitated, reminding her of his promise to Henry and of everything he stood to lose. Mary would not be moved. Brandon later wrote to England that he had never seen a woman weep as she did. Francis I, for his own reasons, quietly encouraged the match. On the 3rd of March, 1515, in a small chapel at the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, Mary and Brandon married in secret, with fewer than a dozen witnesses present, Francis himself among them. Both of them understood what they were risking. Brandon was risking nearly 2 decades of friendship and everything he had built at Henry's court, hoping Henry's affection for them would prove stronger than his anger. Mary was giving up the certainty of her rank as a dowager queen for the far less certain future of being married to a man with no royal blood of his own. It was, in the strictest legal sense, treason. Brandon had married an English princess without the king's consent, an offense that carried the penalty of death. When word reached England, several members of Henry's own council argued for exactly that outcome: Brandon's arrest and possibly his execution. As royalty, Mary herself was never in real danger of the same punishment. The risk belonged almost entirely to her husband. Both Mary and Brandon wrote to Henry at once, confessing what they had done and begging forgiveness. Mary reminded her brother of the promise he had made her the year before. Cardinal Wolsey, who had negotiated Mary's first marriage and had every reason to want this second crisis resolved quietly rather than as a public scandal, spent weeks working to calm the king, reminding him of the deep affection he held for both his sister and his closest friend. The fury did not lead to execution. The couple agreed instead to pay £24,000 in yearly installments of £1,000 on top of surrendering the full dowry Mary had brought from her marriage to Louis and the gold plate and jewels he had left her. It was an amount large enough to strain their finances for years to come. Henry eventually reduced the burden, but the debt shaped the couple's finances for much of their marriage. On the 13th of May, 1515, Mary and Brandon married again, this time publicly, at Greenwich, with Henry and Catherine of Aragon among the guests. The scandal was absorbed into the family. Mary kept the title Duchess of Suffolk, though court habit continued to address her as the French queen. What followed was, for a while, an ordinary domestic life, a considerable change for a woman who had been raised from infancy to expect a throne. The couple split their time between Court and Westhorpe Hall, their estate in Suffolk, where Mary raised her own children alongside Brandon's 2 daughters from his earlier marriage. A son, Henry, was born in 1516, a daughter, Frances, in 1517, another daughter, Eleanor, around 1520. The son did not survive to adulthood. Locally, in Suffolk, Mary and her husband kept a kind of provincial court of their own. When they visited Bury Fair, the market town near their estate, they reportedly set up a pavilion and received local visitors much as royalty would, a habit that showed how Mary, even living in a country manor, still carried herself according to the rank she had been born into. In June of 1520, Mary and her husband joined Henry's court at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, an 18-day summit near Calais where Henry and Francis I each tried to display more wealth and host grander feasts than the other, all in the name of a peace neither side entirely trusted. Thousands of workers built a temporary city of tents for the occasion, including a vast pavilion of wood and canvas covered in cloth of gold, where jousting, wrestling, and banqueting filled each day. Mary and Brandon were given quarters inside the king's own pavilion, a sign of how close the family still stood to the throne. The family's position at court declined badly in the years after. By the late 1520s, Henry had set his mind on ending his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry one of the Queen's own ladies-in-waiting, Anne Boleyn, from the same family that had once sent a young girl to serve in Mary's own household in France. Mary took a side, and it was not her brother's. She had known Catherine since childhood. The Spanish princess had arrived in England to marry Mary's elder brother Arthur when Mary was only 5, and had remained at the English court after Arthur's early death, eventually marrying Henry instead. By the late 1520s, the 2 women had been close for more than 2 decades, and Mary counted her a friend. Toward Anne Boleyn, she showed open contempt, a feeling shared by much of the older nobility around the throne, who regarded the king's new choice as an unworthy replacement for a queen who had reigned for 20 years. The dispute was no longer a private matter between a husband and wife. It was becoming a political and religious crisis that would end in England's break from the Roman Catholic Church, and Mary's own household stood visibly on the losing side of it. The rivalry between the two families stopped being a matter of gossip in March of 1532, when a servant of the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's uncle, killed a member of Charles Brandon's household in a street fight. Nothing about the killing was resolved cleanly, but it made the hostility between the Boleyns and the Suffolks impossible to ignore. In January of 1533, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony, months before his marriage to Catherine had even been formally annulled by the Church. It would fall to Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, to declare that first marriage void that May, well after the second one had already taken place. Mary did not attend. She did not attend Anne's public coronation that June either, an absence anyone at court would have understood as a statement. Her own health was failing badly by then. The sweating sickness epidemic of 1528 had swept through England that summer, killing thousands and forcing the royal court to scatter repeatedly to avoid infection. Mary survived it, but her health never fully recovered, and the years that followed brought recurring bouts of illness that worsened as the decade continued. By early 1533, the England Mary had grown up in was very different from the one she now saw around her. Her brother had broken with Rome. Catherine had been cast aside. A woman Mary had refused for years to acknowledge now wore a crown of her own. Mary spent her final months mostly at Westhorpe, away from the court she had once entered as a crowned queen herself. Mary dies at Westhorpe Hall on the 25th of June, 1533. She is 37 years old. The exact cause is not recorded with certainty. Later historians have proposed tuberculosis, cancer, or a heart condition, and some have pointed to the strain of watching her brother's marriage collapse and reform around a woman she despised. Charles Brandon, occupied at that moment with preparations for Anne Boleyn's coronation, is not at her side. Anne herself is visibly pregnant that summer, carrying the child that Henry hopes will finally be his son. 2.5 months later, she will give birth to a daughter instead, a girl named Elizabeth. Despite everything, Mary had not turned against her brother personally. Not long before her death, she had written to him that she hoped to see him again soon, having been away from him for so long. Her body is embalmed and laid in state at Westhorpe for 3 weeks, the coffin draped in blue and black velvet, candles kept burning around it day and night. Henry orders a requiem mass at Westminster Abbey in his sister's honor. A delegation crosses from France to join the English mourners gathering for the funeral. On the 20th of July, Mary is carried to Bury St. Edmund's Abbey and buried there in a tomb of alabaster. Her daughter Frances serving as chief mourner among a train of family and household. It is one of the last great ceremonies the Abbey will ever hold before its own end arrives. Within 6 years, Henry's break with Rome reached Bury St. Edmund's too, and the Abbey was dissolved along with hundreds of others across England. Mary's remains were moved to the nearby parish church of St. Mary, where they still rest today. A lock of her hair, still pale gold, is kept in the town's museum. The warship built for her brother's navy and named in her honor outlasted her by 12 years. The Mary Rose, launched in 1511, while Mary was still waiting on a husband to be chosen for her, served in England's wars against France and Scotland for more than 3 decades before sinking in the Solent in 1545 during battle against a French invasion fleet. It was not raised again until 1982, when archaeologists brought the wreck to the surface after more than 4 centuries underwater. The remains of the ship are preserved today in a museum in Portsmouth, not far from where it first sailed. Charles Brandon had remarried less than 3 months after Mary's death to Catherine Willoughby, a 14-year-old ward of his household who had originally been intended as a bride for his own son. He died in 1545, the same year the Mary Rose went down. Mary's own bloodline outlasted her by far longer. Her daughter Frances married Henry Grey, who became Duke of Suffolk, and their daughter Jane Grey grew into one of the most learned young women in England, fluent in several languages and devoted to the Protestant faith that had taken hold in the country since her great-uncle's break with Rome. In May of 1553, Jane was married to Lord Guildford Dudley, son of the powerful Duke of Northumberland. Weeks later, Mary's nephew, King Edward VI, lay dying without an heir of his own. Concerned that the crown would pass to his Catholic half-sister and undo the religious reforms of his reign, he set aside the claims of both his half-sisters and named Jane Grey his successor instead. Jane held the throne for 9 days before Edward's elder half-sister Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, gathered enough support to take it back by force. Jane Grey was executed the following year, not yet 17 years old. There is a symmetry in this that no one arranged, but no one avoided either. Mary Tudor spent her last years defending Catherine of Aragon's claim over Anne Boleyn's, and it was Catherine's own daughter who ended the brief reign of Mary's granddaughter 2 decades later. 2 women who did not live to see it were, in their own way, still settling a dispute that had begun decades earlier at the court of the king who was brother to one and husband to the other. Mary Tudor spent most of her life handed from one negotiation to the next, promised at 2, betrothed at 8, married at 18 to a king 3 times her age, widowed within 3 months, and immediately treated as an asset for a second political match. Only once did she act purely on her own terms, marrying a man without the title or fortune to match her rank, at the risk of his life and her own position. It nearly cost them everything. It did not. She spent the rest of her life as the Duchess of Suffolk, known out of old habit as the Queen of France, a title that had lasted 82 days and stayed attached to her name for the remaining 18 years of her life. It was the only crown she ever wore. The marriage that followed it, chosen entirely on her own terms, was very nearly the only choice she was ever allowed to make.